Good morning, News Talk 1330 WLBB. It's 8:31. You're listening to the Community Voice, and the voice of Adam Uglum here, as often as 2 times a week, with a little political insight from a little different perspective. A younger guy, a political scientist, a libertarian, on a local radio show where we get to talk and discuss and take phone calls and do whatever on the Community Voice program. And today we're talking about largely 2 main things. One, Super Tuesday, which was yesterday, and we'll get into oil drilling as well. That's a topic I wanted to discuss as well, but I can't avoid Super Chooseday, as it's being called. So Newt Gingrich won Georgia. Woo-hoo. If he didn't win Georgia, Newt Gingrich said he would step out of the race. Well, looks like Newt Gingrich is sticking around because he handily won Georgia as was expected. However, it was the only state that Gingrich won. Romney managed to pull away with Idaho, Massachusetts, Ohio, Virginia, Vermont, and Arkansas. Santorum managed to get Oklahoma, North Dakota, and Tennessee. The font is a little small. Didn't want to get them wrong. So as far as total delegates go so far, Mitt Romney takes the lead by quite a bit at 404 delegates pledged to Mitt Romney. Rick Santorum at 165 total delegates so far. Newt Gingrich at 106 and Ron Paul at 66. As much of a big show and as much as Newt Gingrich has talked about, he's not much far ahead of Ron Paul. Before last night, I believe he only had about 8 delegates ahead of Ron Paul. So really they were about on the same level as far as delegates go, but yesterday, Super Tuesday, changed all of that. It was looking like Ron Paul was going to do very well in North Dakota, and he did, but he did not win in North Dakota. Looking at the headlines on the Drudge Report, it's pretty interesting. It's got a very old picture of Mitt Romney back when he was doing the Olympics, holding the torch and pledging allegiance to the flag, and the headline is finally. And you know what it looks like more and more is that the coronation of Mitt Romney is inevitable, as has kind of been the talk so far this entire election, is that Mitt Romney is the inevitable candidate. He was, one of the front runners last time. The Republican establishment wanted Mitt Romney last time in the what wound up being the 2008 McCain-Obama race. Could have also been the Mitt Romney-Obama race. And it makes me wonder what would have happened if Mitt Romney would have been the candidate back then, if he would have done better. Because he was somewhat popular back then, I guess, but then again, so was everyone else. Fred Thompson did very well, and so did Mike Huckabee as well. These things are so hard to call, and even now, conventional wisdom says it's still too early to call, but Mitt Romney sure is looking awfully good from a delegate standpoint, with more than double the second place, more than second and third place combined, and almost as many as his 3 competitors combined. So it's... Matter of fact, I think he has more than all of his competitors combined. But talk about an interesting GOP race. Newt Gingrich won Georgia, so he's sticking around. And I think Newt Gingrich has brought an interesting aspect to the table. And what happens with this long, drawn-out process, I know it's expensive and tumultuous, and all of us are just tired. It's hard to believe that the convention isn't until, August? That we're not going to have a candidate? And then we'll have 3 debates with the president before the election. Now, it is my dream. I mean, I dream about it every night, to see Newt Gingrich and President Obama debating on stage. I would just be filled with excitement, though it doesn't look like that's going to happen. While Newt Gingrich isn't my favorite candidate, I can't tell you how much popcorn I would consume watching Newt Gingrich and President Obama debate. That would just be stellar. I would be the happiest kid in the entire world. I wouldn't even need anything for Christmas next year if I got to see Newt Gingrich and President Obama in a debate. So anyway, we're going to take our first break and come right back and talk about something a little more important than the presidential primary race, because we all kind of know what's going to happen here. Who knows? We may have a brokered convention. I don't want to call it unimportant, but it's a strange primary, and that's about the best word you can give to it. But it looks like more and more that the inevitable Mitt is the inevitable Mitt, and he will be coronated sometime in August. Back after this quick message. Good morning. The telephone number is 678-601-8255. Again, that number is 678-601-TALK. If you'd like to call and be part of the program. And having talked about the Super Chooseday, because it does not deserve much talk if you ask me, we're going to move on to talking about something I feel is a little more important, and that's the topic of gas prices and oil drilling. Something that I think a lot of people are awfully concerned about. And it's interesting to me, in all my studies in political science, regardless of what's going on in the national climate, the economy, people's wallets are generally always on top of the concern by the public. Social issues rank very low on a national level. So maybe that's why it's what we talk about so much when it comes to political stuff. Sure, we get in heated debates about contentious issues like contraception, abortion, things like that, healthcare, but I can guarantee you most of the conversations out there are about taxes, debt, spending, wars, things like that. It's all about the cost of what the government does, and because it directly impacts our pocket. We are a lot more interested than what affects us than what affects someone else. Even when it comes to very serious issues like the pro-life movement or the drug movement, the pro-drug movement. It always boils down to what affects me most. And what affects you most is the economy, by and large. We know this. So what's interesting to me is I was driving home from Haralson County last night. I was covering the election out there, the District 2 Commissioner race among the presidential preference primary, which made it all the more exciting because the presidential preference primary is pretty straightforward. It's just a one-vote thing. So having the District 2 Commissioner race along with that made it a little more interesting to go out to Haralson County last night. So I was driving home, and I haven't filled up my car. My car gets a lot of really good gas mileage, and I don't fill up too often, about every 8-9 days probably. So I'm driving by a Shell station, I think, and I noticed that gas prices are $3.70 on the Shell station side. And I know Shell is usually a little more expensive than everybody else, a few cents, but who cares? I have a 10-gallon gas tank. What's 30 cents? And I keep thinking to myself, when I started driving, which wasn't that long ago. It was only 7 years ago, I think. 2005. I could fill up my car for less than $20. I remember going to the BP station back. I was really proud of my car. I'd go to the BP station on Maple Street. I was really proud of my car, my first Honda Civic, and I'd fill it up with the best gas I could buy. And I'd go in and proudly hand the clerk a $20 bill and had a hard time fitting all $20 of gasoline in my Honda Civic. And now my average fill-up's closer to $40. That's a big jump in 5 years. Or I guess 7 years. $3.70. There's parts of the country that are seeing $4 in gas. A lot of California, much of southern Florida is seeing over $4 a gallon in gas. I've got a friend who lives in California, told me yesterday that he has to fill his car with premium, and he's paying $4.34 a gallon for gas in California. So what I'd like to point out is that President Obama's administration, not only the president, but all of his staff, has a pretty warped view on the president's achievements on oil and drilling. Now, hold on a second. I think they have a pretty warped view on his achievements on everything, to be perfectly honest. They accredit the booming economy to Obama's policies as well, even though we have probably the slowest recovery from a recession in history. If you look at the onset of recessions and the onset of recovery, it is about half the pace of Bush's economic recovery, Reagan's economic recovery, even going back to John F. Kennedy's economic recovery, and especially Calvin Coolidge. My goodness, talk about a recovery. There's a reason we call the 20s the Roaring 20s. We learned that they are the Roaring 20s in high school, but we never learned why they were the Roaring 20s. It was because Calvin Coolidge cut the size of government by a third, if I recall correctly. One of the biggest cuts in federal government in the history of our country under Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding. And yet, it's not mentioned at all that led to extreme prosperity in the 1920s. Though some would blame the Great Depression on the giant cut in government as well, but that's absolutely false. a lot of the Great Depression can absolutely be blamed on, one, FDR and Hoover. They were very similar, Hoover and FDR. They both had very similar policies. FDR basically said, well, you didn't do enough in your policies, and took them and expanded them vastly. FDR is an interesting basket case. I think I did a show on him. It may be time to do another FDR show. So back to oil prices. Jay Carney, for example, at a press briefing last week, said this, quote, and suggested that somehow simply by drilling or approving the Keystone XL pipeline, that would lower gas prices at the pump. And that's the kind of empty promise that politicians make when we face hikes in the global price of oil. That is really dishonest with the kind of promises that are really dishonest with the American people. Also, let's keep in mind that oil production is down 40% on federal lands under Obama. Oil production is up, as I mentioned in a previous program, but that's largely due to the massive expansion in oil production in North Dakota around the Bakken Oil Reserve that covers kind of the tri-state area of North, South Dakota, and Montana. Not to mention that Ken Salazar, Obama's Interior Secretary, has locked away oil reserves of the United States. Did you know that North Dakota has a 3.5% unemployment rate? They've got about 50,000 jobs they can't fill because they simply just don't have the people to fill those jobs. They aren't qualified for it. I can guarantee you there are people looking for work in North Dakota, but there are 50,000 people who don't exist in North Dakota to work the jobs that are needed in North Dakota. Do a Google search on the oil boom in North Dakota. You'll hear some amazing stories. So, with regard to the Keystone XL pipeline, here's a brief excerpt from an article out of Real Clear Politics. The annual trade deficit on petroleum is about $300 billion. Raising U.S. oil production to its sustainable potential of 10 million barrels a day would cut import costs in half. Directly create 1.5 million jobs, and applying administration economic models for stimulus spending would create another 1 million jobs indirectly. Overall, attaining U.S. oil production potential would boost gross domestic product by about $250 billion. And granted, the administration's economic models are very optimistic. We'll call it 2 million jobs created. According to the administration even. And that's a low number, according to the administration. So here's the predicament. And this is what always drives me nuts about the logic of the left, is that it's unethical to drill for oil here. It's unethical to drill for oil anywhere in the United States, apparently. They have less of a problem with the fact that we use oil, and they can't come to terms with the fact that oil is not going anywhere anytime soon. There is not a viable alternative yet that is affordable to the average American consumer that would replace oil in the United States. So, if we can get the left, who can't come to grips with much, get them to come to grips with the fact that oil ain't going anywhere anytime soon. The best we can do is make it cheaper for the American public. So instead of buying oil from Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, not that we get much from the Middle East, about 60% of U.S. oil comes from the Western Hemisphere. So the idea that we send a whole lot of money over to the Middle East is a little watered down when you get to the facts. I mean, think about it. How expensive do you think it is to fill up an oil tanker and ship it, 15,000 miles from the Arabian Peninsula? It's pretty expensive. We get a lot of oil from Canada and Mexico especially. And we're getting more and more from North Dakota, and it costs about $30 less per barrel. We just need more of it. Again, production on federal lands is down 40%. The federal government leases a lot of land to oil drilling companies to produce oil. And tight regulations and restrictions on oil companies is leading to lower production. Also, let me remind you, If you don't know who Energy Secretary Stephen Chu is, he said last week that it was not the goal of the administration to lower gas prices directly. In fact, Obama has since suggested increasing taxes on oil companies. Is this really our president's understanding of how to lower gas prices, by increasing taxes that are then passed on to the consumer in the form of higher gas prices? The numbers vary on who you ask, but Exxon makes anywhere from 2 to 5 cents per gallon of gasoline sold. The states and the federal government make anywhere from 50 to 75 cents per gallon of gasoline sold. $45 to 75 cents of gas of every gallon of gas sold, So who is the real profiteer here? Now, this money is often used to finance road construction, which is an interesting way to look at it, I suppose. They don't think that road construction should come out of those who don't drive on the roads, even though that's not very many people at all. Personally, I think that road construction should come out of general funds, and that we shouldn't tax gasoline at all, but that's my personal conviction. I understand that taxing gasoline is an effective way to do it, but as much as I talk about the fair tax, and people rail against me for having a regressive income tax, a regressive sales tax that indirectly affects the poor, all you have to do is bring up gasoline taxes, alcohol and cigarette taxes, and anything else that we tax that is a consumer good that we tax especially because we don't want it, like chewing tobacco, cigarettes, ammunition, hunting supplies, all of the things that I've mentioned, from gasoline to hunting supplies, chewing, all of it, every last bit of it is disproportionately consumed by the poorest people in the country. So a lot of the consumer goods that we tax extra because we don't like them, or because we want to use those taxes to finance something else, are already regressive sales taxes. State sales taxes, for example, in Georgia are 6%. That is a regressive tax, according to many. Many states across the country have a sales tax, a flat sales tax. You don't pay more or less sales tax because of how rich or how poor you are. You pay the same sales tax everybody else does. I don't see anybody complaining about the regressive sales taxes. We're going to come back after this break and talk about the myth of oil subsidies. Back after this.
Because of you and generations who came before, we benefit from the same level of health care you'd expect from much larger cities. It began with nickels, dimes, and quarters collected to build West Georgia's first hospital. Over the 60 years since, we've saved hundreds of hearts, delivered thousands of babies, and been there for tens of thousands of people, providing cancer care, surgical care, emergency care, and more. But none of those services would be here without you. Without those services, there's a good chance many of our neighbors, friends, and loved ones wouldn't be here either. That's what makes your support so important. Now, with 4 hospitals and more than 250 physicians, Tanner keeps the care you need right down the road, not down the interstate.
Because of you, we're here.
Tanner Health System.
Alrighty, back after the break. 9 minutes left in the program. We'll see if I can't pour through this article. You got to be careful with your P's. You can't be too close to the microphone. It sounds bad. All right, so everybody from all sides of the spectrum want to end oil subsidies, from President Obama to John Boehner, Paul Ryan. My question, what subsidies? Remarkably enough, CNN Money has an article that provides us with the answer. It turns out that they are all tax breaks. And we have to be very hesitant to even call them tax breaks because some of them amount to little more than Congress defining accounting terms such as capital equipment and the total amount of earnings not collected in taxes, which the left prefers to define as a subsidy, is about $4 billion per year. And here is how that breaks down. Domestic manufacturing tax deduction, $1.7 billion, according to CNN Money. This is a tax deduction given to every manufacturer in the U.S. Per CNN, it was designed to keep factories in the U.S. If that deduction were eliminated for oil companies only, it would mean singling out oil companies from all other manufacturers. Percentage depletion allowance, $1 billion. Any industry can write down a portion of the cost of its capital equipment as part of the cost of doing business. Right now, oil in the ground is treated as capital equipment. Again, this subsidy amounts to how the cost of doing business is defined. All companies get it, not just oil companies. Foreign tax credit, $850 million. Companies get credit for taxes they pay to other countries. All companies get this subsidy, not just oil companies. Should a company pay tax on tax? Or should only oil companies pay tax on tax? Interesting question. Intangible drilling costs, $780 million. According to CNN, all industries get to write off the costs of doing business, but they must take it over the life of an investment. The oil industry gets to take the drilling credit in the first year. Among these 4 tax breaks, this smallest one was the only one that treated oil companies differently. $780 million a year. And it's the only one that treats oil companies differently from other companies. The only one of the $4 billion that oil companies get per year. The above tax breaks, or tax subsidies, as we'll call them, only explain how much tax revenue is not collected from oil companies. Well, how much is collected? Exxon recently released its first quarter results for 2011. It is a publicly owned company. This information is public. The number grabbing the headlines was Exxon's profit of $10.65 billion in a single quarter. The number not given quite as much exposure was the taxes it paid in that same quarter, $8 billion, or 42% of income before taxes. And what does Exxon do with all of the money it has left after paying $8 billion in taxes? Well, it put $7.8 billion into capital and exploration as part of its plans to invest between $33 billion and $37 billion per year over the next 5 years to develop new energy supplies. In any other industry, that would be called research and development. Exxon is plowing 73% of its after-tax profits back into research and development. Who would be better at spending $4 billion of energy companies' earnings in an attempt to provide our energy in the future? Energy companies or President Obama? Does Solyndra ring a bell? Do you know what oil company does get U.S. subsidies and not just tax breaks? Petrobras, Brazil's state-owned oil company. According to the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. is going to lend billions of dollars to Brazil's state-owned oil company, Petrobras, to finance exploration of the huge offshore discovery in Brazil's Tupi oil field in the Santos Basin near Rio de Janeiro. Brazil's planning minister confirmed the White House National Security Advisor, James Jones, met this month with Brazilian officials to talk about the loan. So just to recap, these subsidies that go to oil companies that Obama wants to cut, they are all tax breaks or earnings that oil companies get to keep, not money paid to them out of the U.S. Treasury. There's a big difference. The amount of earnings not collected in taxes is about $4.3 billion per year, about 0.2% of this year's deficit, and enough to fund about 10 hours of current U.S. government spending. A full $3.55 billion of that amount is due to the way taxes are treated for all industries or manufacturers. To change these tax laws only for oil companies would require singling them out among all industries for special mistreatment. Sounds like a bill of attainder to me, something our Constitution forbids. The only tax in which the oil industry seems to get special treatment compared to other industries is intangible drilling costs. The amount of that subsidy, $780 million per year, enough to fund less than 2 hours of federal spending in 2011, and not even half of the amount that we are lending to a foreign-owned and state-owned oil company drilling offshore in deeper waters than the BP oil spill in Brazil. I think they're drilling at 3 times the depth that the BP oil spill happened in. Yet we're sending billions to a state-owned oil company. Oil companies already pay tax rates of 40 to 50% of their income. For one company, Exxon, in 1/4 of 1 year, that amount was $8 billion, or almost double the so-called tax subsidy for oil companies for an entire year. These are the facts. And you might not realize it, but private oil companies don't own much oil either. Most oil in the ground, in fact, 87% of the world's supply, is owned by state-owned companies, and most of that by OPEC countries and Russia. Exxon, for example, owns only 0.68% of worldwide oil reserves. Venezuela owns 7.34% of the world's oil reserves, more than 10 times as much as Exxon. What Exxon does is explore, drill, and transport, refine, and distribute. It makes money by doing things, not sitting on capital. So if you really want to know who to blame for gas prices, keep in mind that the governments of the world own most, effectively all, of the oil in the world. Whether it be Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, the U.S. The U.S. owns most of the oil that's produced in the U.S. Oil production on federal lands is down 40%. That is an administrative role. The Department of the Interior, the Department of Energy, those organizations get to decide what goes on with that. So if you want to blame the cost of gas on somebody, blame it on who's making the most money. At 45 to 70 cents a gallon, Uncle Sam and your state government. Last week's shows and the 2 shows from this week will be available on my YouTube channel. You can find them on my website, libertariats.wordpress.com. Also shoot me an email, libertariats@gmail.com.